On March 30th, 1867, the Russian Empire, one of the most powerful nations in the world at the time, made a decision that would echo through history. It sold its vast, remote territory of Alaska to the United States. But why would a major empire, rich in resources, let go of such a prize? Was it truly a sale? Or was it a secretive transaction that we still don't fully understand? And, most importantly, did Russia even receive the money it was promised? For decades, myths and debates have surrounded this extraordinary event. Was it a stroke of genius? A desperate move? Or an imperial blunder? Was this an early sign of Russia's weakening grip on its territories, or a strategic pivot to more pressing matters in Europe and Asia? In the decades since, the sale of Alaska has become a symbol of loss. But it's much more than that. Much deeper, much more complex, and perhaps even far more consequential than anyone realized at the time. Why did Russia sell a land so vast, so rich in untapped resources, and so strategically important in the Pacific? How did such an important decision come to pass? And what did it mean for the empire that let go of it? Was this truly a case of a failing empire giving away its future? Or was there something more at play? The answers to these questions have remained shrouded in mystery, fueled by rumors, misinformation, and speculation. Let's peel back the layers of history to uncover the truth about the sale of Alaska. What really happened when Russia parted ways with one of its most coveted territories? And why did the United States take the plunge to acquire it? Alaska, named from the Aleut word meaning great land, was, indeed, a vast and rugged territory. Stretching across nearly 1,700 kilometers, it was a land that appeared to hold endless potential. From its sprawling coastlines to its towering mountains, Alaska's sheer size was staggering, and its strategic location along the Pacific coast only added to its value. The first Europeans to glimpse the shores of Alaska were members of the expedition led by Semyon Dezhnyov in 1648. While they didn't land on the land itself, they navigated through the Bering Strait and caught sight of its distant shores. However, it wasn't until the reign of Tsar Peter the Great that the Russian Empire took its first formal steps toward claiming the land. In 1732, Russian expeditions began actively exploring the region. It was Vitus Bering, an explorer commissioned by the Russian Empire, who became the first to sail through the Bering Strait and reach the shores of Alaska. His discovery in 1741 opened the door for Russian claims to the land, officially marking the beginning of Russia's presence in Alaska. By 1741, Alaska had become part of the Russian Empire's growing empire, although at the time it was seen more as a remote and somewhat neglected frontier. Yet, even from the start, Alaska's fur trade proved to be immensely valuable. The fur-bearing animals, like otters, seals, and sea lions, brought wealth to Russia, and the expansive fishing waters began to attract Russian settlers, traders, and hunters. By the early 19th century, Alaska was no longer a new acquisition. It had become an integral part of Russia's far-reaching empire. However, despite its apparent wealth, Alaska began to present more challenges than opportunities. The land was remote, isolated, and difficult to defend. It was nearly impossible to communicate with or send supplies from Russia's heartland, and maintaining control over such a vast, cold land required an enormous amount of resources. The fur trade, which had initially made Alaska a prized possession for Russia, began to dwindle. By the mid-1800s, the fur-bearing animals that had once been abundant were becoming scarce, and the once lucrative industry was in decline. Moreover, Russia had already established lucrative trade routes with China and the Pacific, and the value of Alaska's furs began to diminish in comparison. But it wasn't just the fur trade that presented difficulties. Alaska's geographical location made it nearly impossible to defend in the event of conflict, particularly with the growing power of the United States. In the 1850s, Russia had to face the reality that keeping such a distant land was becoming more of a liability than an asset. The idea of losing control of Alaska to a foreign power, particularly the British or Americans, became a genuine concern for Russian officials. In addition, Alaska's native population, consisting of Aleuts, Eskimos, and various indigenous tribes, began to grow restive as Russian settlers encroached on their land and resources. Tensions between the colonizers and the indigenous groups escalated, leading to violent skirmishes. Though Russia's military presence on the ground was significant, the costs of maintaining control over the land were high and not yielding the returns Russia had hoped for. By the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire was facing mounting financial difficulties. The costs of maintaining its distant territories, particularly Alaska, were becoming increasingly unmanageable. The Russian-American Company, once a profitable enterprise, was now in decline. Established in 1799 to manage the fur trade and other economic activities in Alaska, the company had once been one of the most profitable ventures of the empire. However, by the 1850s, the company was deeply in debt, owing approximately 722,000 rubles in gold to the Russian state. The company's troubles were compounded by the dwindling fur trade. The once abundant sea otter populations were nearly extinct due to overhunting, and the fur-bearing animals in the region had become harder to find. The fur trade, which had been the primary source of profit, was no longer providing the returns that had once justified the expense of maintaining Alaska. In addition to the challenges of the fur trade, the Russian-American Company faced logistical problems. The land was difficult to navigate, and the colony had limited infrastructure. The company relied heavily on Russian settlers and local indigenous groups to carry out its operations. But as tensions with the native population grew, the company's operations became increasingly strained. With Alaska's resources dwindling and the company in financial turmoil, Russia was forced to face the harsh reality that Alaska, once a valuable asset, had become a burden. The Russian government was no longer able to maintain the territory, and the idea of selling it began to gain traction. The Crimean War, which took place between 1853 and 1856, was a turning point for the Russian Empire. After suffering a devastating defeat at the hands of the British, French, and Ottoman Empire, Russia's military and financial position was severely weakened. The empire's once formidable presence in Europe had been diminished, and its ability to defend distant territories like Alaska became increasingly questionable. The war left Russia with a shattered economy, mounting debts, and a demoralized army. The empire's treasury was drained, and the Russian leadership found themselves struggling to maintain control over their vast and growing empire. In this context, Alaska, located thousands of miles away from the Russian heartland, was viewed as a liability. The difficulty of defending the region in the event of an attack from Britain or the United States became a significant concern. Moreover, Russia's defeat in the Crimean War left it isolated on the international stage. The empire's failure to defend its interests in Europe made it clear that Russia's military power was no longer what it once was. With the United States growing stronger and expanding westward, Russia saw the writing on the wall. Alaska, which had once been seen as a strategic asset, now seemed increasingly vulnerable, and the possibility of losing it to a foreign power became a real concern. By the mid-1850s, the Russian Empire's position regarding Alaska had become clear. Its maintenance was no longer sustainable. But what could be done? The solution emerged in the form of a proposal to sell the land, and the United States was the most likely buyer. The idea of selling Alaska to the United States had been discussed as early as the 1850s, but it wasn't until the aftermath of the Crimean War and Russia's financial struggles that the idea gained real momentum. In 1857, Russia began to consider the possibility of selling Alaska to the United States, but negotiations would take years to materialize. At the same time, American interest in Alaska was growing. The United States, eager to expand westward and secure its territorial holdings, had its sights set on Alaska. Many saw it as an opportunity to complete the continental map and secure valuable resources, although some initially viewed it as a waste of money. The negotiations, however, were not straightforward. The United States was embroiled in its own issues, namely the Civil War, which began in 1861. This conflict delayed the deal, but it did not stop it. Despite internal turmoil, American diplomats were still eager to negotiate, and in the midst of the war, a deal was struck. In 1867, after years of back-and-forth discussions, Russia and the United States reached an agreement. The Russian Empire agreed to sell Alaska for the sum of $7,200,000, an amount that, in hindsight, seems remarkably low considering the territory's vast potential. The sale was controversial at the time. In the United States, the deal was mocked by some as Seward's Folly, named after William Seward, the United States Secretary of State who championed the acquisition. Many believed that the land was too remote and inhospitable to be of any real value. For Russia, the sale represented a necessary step. The money from the deal would help alleviate some of the empire's financial woes and allow it to focus on more pressing matters in Europe and Asia. But while the sale was seen as a practical decision, it came at a steep cost. Alaska was not just a landmass, but a symbol of Russia's once expanding empire. The immediate reaction to the sale of Alaska was mixed, both in the United States and in Russia. In America, many initially ridiculed the deal, calling it Seward's Folly and questioning the wisdom of acquiring such a remote and seemingly barren territory. The United States press was particularly critical, with some publications even joking about the 50,000 Eskimos that would come with the purchase, highlighting the perceived uselessness of the land. But while the press lampooned the deal, it also began to subtly build a narrative of expansionism and the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to spread across the entire North American continent. On the other side of the world, in Russia, the sale was perceived as a major loss. It was seen as the end of an era, an empire losing its grip on distant territories. The transaction, shrouded in secrecy, was not immediately made public. It wasn't until months later, when the details of the sale were officially revealed, that the Russian people fully understood what had transpired. The public reaction was one of shock, and many viewed the sale as a national humiliation. In the years that followed, the value of Alaska would become apparent. The discovery of gold in the late 19th century sparked a gold rush, and by the early 20th century, oil reserves were found beneath its land. Alaska, once seen as a cold, barren wasteland, transformed into a highly valuable asset, and the United States began to reap the rewards of its purchase. Alaska would become a key part of the United States economy, particularly during the oil booms of the 20th century, and would play a vital role in the geopolitical struggles of the Cold War. But for Russia, the decision to sell Alaska marked the beginning of a long decline. The Russian Empire's loss of Alaska symbolized a broader weakening of imperial power. The sale was not just a financial transaction, but a sign of Russia's diminishing influence on the world stage. It was a blow to Russian prestige, and the loss of Alaska would echo for years, particularly during the Soviet era, when discussions about the territory's rightful ownership would occasionally surface. In the United States, Alaska's acquisition helped secure the nation's position as a growing power in the Pacific. The deal marked a turning point, not just in American expansion, but in its international relations. The purchase was one of the first significant steps in America's rise as a global superpower, and the territory would play a crucial role in United States military strategy during the 20th century. Looking back, the sale of Alaska is often viewed as a turning point in history, one that had far-reaching consequences for both Russia and the United States. In the years following the sale, Alaska would become one of the most valuable territories in the United States, its natural resources transforming the region into an economic powerhouse. The discovery of gold in the late 19th century sent thousands of prospectors rushing to the region during the Klondike Gold Rush, marking the beginning of a new era of prosperity. By the early 20th century, oil was discovered in Alaska, and with it, the region's importance only grew. Alaska became a critical part of the United States' industrial complex, and its resources played a major role in fueling the nation's economic expansion. The state's strategic importance also grew, particularly during World War II, when it served as a key military outpost during the conflict with Japan. Alaska's location in the Pacific made it an invaluable asset, and its role in global geopolitics became increasingly apparent as the world moved into the Cold War. For Russia, the sale of Alaska would remain a point of regret for many years. The decision was often criticized in retrospect, with some historians arguing that Russia had let go of a valuable asset that could have provided significant economic and strategic benefits. The loss of Alaska, coupled with the empire's struggles in other regions, marked the beginning of Russia's long decline. The Russian Empire would collapse just a few decades later, in 1917, during the Russian Revolution. Despite the regrets that followed, the sale of Alaska also marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. For the United States, the acquisition of Alaska was a key moment in its rise to global prominence. The purchase, once seen as a foolish move, proved to be a stroke of genius, providing the United States with a valuable piece of territory that would play a crucial role in the country's economic and military development. The sale of Alaska, which took place on March 30, 1867, was more than just a financial transaction. It marked the end of an era for the Russian Empire, which, despite its vast expanse, was struggling with internal and external pressures. The decision to part with Alaska may have seemed like a loss at the time, but in the long run, it was a catalyst that reshaped the fortunes of both Russia and the United States. For Russia, the sale represented the end of a chapter where the empire once expanded its reach across distant lands, but ultimately faltered under financial strain and military vulnerability. In hindsight, it is clear that Russia's relinquishing of Alaska was not just a matter of losing a landmass. It was a symbol of the empire's diminishing power and influence on the world stage. The sale allowed the Russian Empire to focus on its remaining territories, but it also marked a painful chapter in Russian history, one that was soon followed by the empire's collapse in the early 20th century. For the United States, the acquisition of Alaska was a stepping stone to becoming a global power. Initially ridiculed as Seward's Folly, the purchase would prove to be an invaluable asset. Over the years, Alaska would emerge as a key player in the United States economy and military strategy, its rich natural resources fueling the nation's industrial growth. The discovery of gold and oil in the region transformed Alaska from a seemingly barren land into a critical part of the United States' future prosperity. The strategic value of the territory would be fully realized during World War II and the Cold War, when its location in the Pacific became vital to the United States' defense posture. Looking back, the sale of Alaska may have seemed like a momentary misstep, but it had lasting effects. It set in motion the growth of the United States as a superpower and marked a turning point in global geopolitics. For Russia, it was a painful but necessary sacrifice that allowed the empire to focus on its remaining interests. Though it would ultimately be too late to reverse its decline, the legacy of the sale of Alaska is one of unexpected consequences, and it serves as a reminder of how historical decisions made in times of financial or political crisis can shape the future in ways that are hard to foresee. In the end, Russia's loss was the United States' gain, and the world was forever changed.